Everybody, we have got an awesome guest for you today. His name is Rich Hribar at Lord Reebs, at Lord Reebs on Twitter. The only guy to call me pocket aces. I'm very disappointed. It never caught on, Rich. It never caught on. I don't know what happened.
I tried to make this happen. I think it's just the erasure by your pod co-hosts.
Well, he's a terrible second baseman in softball. I tried to call him E4, but that didn't stick either.
I'm all about that. E4 would work. By the way, Rich is at Sharp Football Analysis, and he's got advanced stats, coming out his ears. We're going to get a lot of them. We're going to talk about I want to know how you evaluate players, what stats are meaningful to you. Talk about wide receivers a lot. Always ends up that way with the advanced stats folk. Who does he like at wide receiver 9, 10, 11, 12, etc.? Actually, I was just on the clock, and he and I were talking about who to take in that group. The Nico Collins. I'm doing the Scott Fishbowl. Nico Collins, Jalen Waddle, Brandon Ayuk, etc. So, I've got a little sneak preview there, and we'll talk about the Texans. We'll talk about the 49ers. How about the Ravens? The Ravens have 4 players being drafted in the top 50 right now. Can you do that? Can you get that kind of production with a mobile quarterback? I'll tell you what I noticed doing some research this morning and much more. Anyway, Rich, how you doing, man? Thanks for being on.
I'm doing great. Post 4th of July, I was looking at my content schedule, and it's like, man, it's like we're here. Like, this is kind of like officially the season. Like for us, football content creators, we're gonna get training camp and just continue to plug away at stuff for the draft kit, and they'll be kicking off. I think we're less than a month away from the first preseason game.
Oh wow, how about that? I would like to.
You see players right now; they're counting down the start of training camp. So. It's
how do you guys feel about those in the industry? It's kind of bittersweet, right? It's you see, it's people count down the days, and it's because you're not gonna be one. It's we're to be in the season grind.
It's been a constant joke for years because Dave Richard has done that forever, counting down the Sundays, and myself and a few of our colleagues just screaming like, why? It's going to be here sooner than we think. I know you're excited. We're all excited about football, but we got some time to breathe a little bit.
Yeah, no, I'm getting all my fun stuff out of, I'm doing a lot of fun stuff this month because it's all over starting in August, basically. But no, football is fun. I can't wait. I can't wait for college football, and I can't wait for the NFL. I'll be a happier person if the Giants could be good. But
are you one of those people excited for the college football game? Or are you a college football gamer? The EA?
What do you mean?
Because it's back this year. Everyone's in on the college football EA game coming out. I think it comes out in 3 days.
No, I'm still only playing Tecmo Bowl on original Nintendo. That's all I work. I played the other day. So let me just get a few quick news items out of the way and get your reactions here. Daniel Popper of The Athletic, he sees Gus Edwards as the clear lead back. You may have seen that headline pop across on whatever Roto World is now, NBC Sports, Sleeper app, whatever it is. He sees Gus Edwards as the clear lead back for the Chargers heading into training camp. But also very interesting, this is what he said about the wide receivers for the Chargers. Josh Palmer is a complete receiver poised for a career season at the top of the depth chart. Ladd McConkey is a pro-ready route runner who's already looking like a perfect fit for Herbert. And then a few sentences later, Daniel Popper of The Athletic says, quote, "It feels like the Chargers are one injury away from Quentin Johnston again playing significant snaps. That worries me." Jamie, that's not good. That's not good for Quentin Johnston.
No, Quentin Johnston's not been good for Quentin Johnston, unfortunately. So this we said it. It's blank canvas essentially with this receiving core. With Palmer being the holdover, and Johnson as well. But Palmer being a guy that has actually produced some level of production that we can hopefully rely on. So yeah, it makes sense that those are the first 2 guys that he would talk about. I think it's the first 2 guys that are going to be drafted in the majority of leagues. Mm-hmm. Most people excited about McConkey. I think we saw yesterday when we were having this conversation in our comments that, a lot of people just saying, why take McConkey where you have to take him? Just wait for Palmer, who might be the better of the 2 from a production standpoint. But after you get past those 2, between Johnston and DJ Chark, it's going to be interesting to see how they use those 2 guys. Adam, I know you're hopeful on Quentin Johnston, being a little bit better in his second year. I don't know how you come out on that, but
I was until this morning.
Well, look, again, opportunity,
right.
and a lot of times, talent, skill, situation, opportunity, they all kind of have to, work together. And he's got one of those things, but the rest of them just don't seem to be on the same page right now with the organization.
Yeah, Rich, can you have as bad of a year as Quentin Johnston had and turn into a good receiver?
Not many have that have been down there. And you're basically hoping for like a Devontae Adams like run, right? Like the only player like that's like he's like the standout. Like people forget like because he's probably going to make the Hall of Fame. The first 2 years of Devontae Adams were an absolute disaster, and that's like kind of what you're hoping for. But the problem is like the top down offense like just isn't going to be conducive probably for 3 wide receiver sets. I mean, during Greg Roman's tenure in San Francisco with Hribar, those teams were 30th in the NFL in rate of 11 personnel. When he was with Buffalo, they were 29th. In Baltimore, they were 32nd. Like this team has basically told us all offseason what they're going to do. I mean, when free agency opened, they signed Gus Edwards, they signed Will Dissly, they draft Joe Alt, with their first pick. Like this team is going to do what Hribar and Roman have done at every stop that they've ever been at. Like this team is going to line up and play. They're going to do the inverse of Brandon Staley, right? Like they're going to play care. They're going to play to protect the football. Whereas like Brandon Staley was a little more carefree, going for 4th downs. Like it's complete night and day. And like they're going to play a lot of close games, I bet. And so we'll see if the Chargers, close game, mishaps will continue to follow Hribar because they're going to play a lot of tight games.
Okay. Mike McDaniel said that the running back group for the Dolphins is pretty much led by Raheem Mostert, but he also said he has not spent any time trying to forecast the running back room because he's going to let the competition determine things. We'll talk about the Dolphins running backs at some point soon. Now, podcastawards.com. Please go nominate us on Podcast Awards. Just go to podcastawards.com. I think it's podcastawards.com/app/sign up. There's a link in the episode description. But if you just go to the main URL, you can get there and nominate fantasy football today in the People's Choice category and the sports category, especially that sports category. Rich has already done it 4 times. He's used 4 different email addresses to nominate fantasy football today for the best podcast in the sports category on podcastawards.com. All right, let me get into the advanced stats and the conversation that we're planning to have here with Rich. We have no idea where this is going to lead. We're just going to kind of give these general topics and see where it goes, see who we end up talking about. But first question for you, if you're going to evaluate a player, Rich, what do you start with? What are the stats that matter to you, and how do you go about evaluating a player?
So I know we want to get into the weeds at some point, but this one's just actually really simple, right? It's like Bud Kilmer just hitting you on the head, like stick to the basics. I mean, the first thing I'm looking, like there's basically 3 things I look for in drafting a fantasy football player. And it's basically like 1, what is his usage? Is he a high usage player in his offense? 2, where is he on the career arc? Is he a younger player still ascending, versus a player that may be like on the backswing? And then does he play on a good team? I know that you want like advanced stats, but like people overlook this all the time. You should be drafting players on good NFL teams. You know what good NFL teams do? They score points. You know what scoring points equals? Fantasy points. It's pretty damn easy. Like those are the things I look for when kind of starting off. And like there are ways to define like a good team, like because we don't always are able to predict the good teams versus the bad teams, or teams kind of come out of nowhere. But you can find some teams that necessarily weren't good last year, like the Falcons are an example, and just look at Vegas lines and current projected points, and they're projected to be 12th in projected points scored this season just by Vegas lines, compared to where they were a year ago. So I mean, I know we'll get into some more advanced things, but like it's as easy as that, man. Draft players on good teams, good young players, because what one fantasy gamers always do, they always get caught up in, is like you got to be smacked in the face with it. So like sometimes like that's why young players, year 2 players especially, typically become like the greatest fantasy values. When you look at like 8 guys that trump ADP, it's always year 2 players, like pretty consistently at every position. So if you want Quentin Johnston, hope there's a switch for you. But because like gamers have to see it first, but young players on good teams, man, it's pretty easy.
Okay. By the way, Jamie, do you know who Bud Kilmer is?
Of course.
Okay, because I just had to look it up. I just completely forgot.
The worst coach ever.
Varsity Blues. Yeah, great movie. All right, I like that.
Adam just remembers the whipped cream scene. That's all.
No, you know what I remember is them playing one of my favorite Offspring songs. Right, I think they play it during at halftime when they're coming out after they're all fired up.
Oh, There Goes My Hero.
No.
The Foo Fighters. That's they do the Foo Fighter song.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that song was super popular when it was out.
That's which song? Which movie do they play Nitro by Offspring? I thought that was Varsity Blues. Maybe that's a different one. You sure they play the My Hero in
Absolutely.
Varsity?
Yeah.
All right. I am confusing my movies. All right. Anywho, so like you like young players. Like, how do you feel about Travis Kelce?
So we talked a little bit about this. I mean, I have no pushback like anyone that has Kelce as their tight end one. You look at just from like a points per game stance. I mean, he had more PPR points per game than Sam Laporta. He matched him in half-point PPR, and that's before even you count for like the playoff production Kelce had, where he looked like Travis Kelce. I will say I do still have Laporta one for edge, like you said, career arc. We got a 23-year-old player versus a 35-year-old player. The Chiefs have reduced Travis Kelce snaps every year for 5 straight years. And then I think when you look at Detroit from a schedule stance, that's what stands out to me in terms of like breaking ties and splitting hairs. I mean, they play one outdoor game through the first 13 weeks, the Detroit Lions. So like we always love those indoor splits for Jared Goff. Granted, I think that some of the like his splits, like his road splits, are kind of misconstrued due to like weather stuff. That's like where you care about Goff the most is like precipitation. Remember Pep Hamilton like dumping the water on the football for him at like his pro day. That's what you care about with Jared Goff. But like the Lions play all these indoor games. They play really two true outdoor games the entire year, at Green Bay, at Chicago. The other one's at San Francisco, and we just saw their offense be completely fine in San Francisco the last time they were on the field. So those things kind of break those ties for me. But if you have Travis Kelce, number one, I have no pushback. I think Travis Kelce at tight end 2 in ADP is a better value than Laporta at tight end 1. I will say that though.
Okay. According to the internet, Nitro was in Varsity Blues as well. So, okay, I don't have to feel terrible there. Jamie, I know he's not going to argue with you about the age thing. He's been avoiding those older wide receivers in the early rounds. Devontae Adams of the world. Keenan Allen was later. Mike Evans, maybe. Okay, so we got to take a break. We'll come back and talk more about, I think, specifically wide receivers and things like that. And we'll be right back with Rich Hribar and Jamie Eisenberg of CBS Sports at Jamie Eisenberg right after this.
Football action continues. Are you ready for this? Ready to take chances? As the gridiron is taken over by the Great White North. It's time to storm the fortress. It's time to fight on the battlefield. Catch the Canadian Football League on CBS Sports Network.
So, Jamie, what's any differences there about what's important to you? He said usage, career arc, good team. How about you? Oh, and age, yeah.
I mean, can you be different on that? That's as smart as anything anybody can say. Is you want those things that those are the obvious ones that matter, of course.
Well, I think with a running back, does a good team matter? So for a running back,
well, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Rich. You just given a blanket statement. There's obviously things you can look at and say.
I thought we were gonna do like the peel the onion thing,
right?
I was just trying to, honestly, I was just trying to get Jamie involved here because I could just talk to Rich the whole time. So I was just trying to throw Jamie a bone here. All right, so let's talk about some wide receiver metrics here. We'll get into the onion, and I look at explosive play rate. Kind of curious about how you feel about ADOT and how much that matters. Anyway, what about some advanced metrics for wide receivers? What do you look at?
Well, now, so we've had like this little manifestation in the NFL due to like the current pocket. I call it the defensive meta, kind of where we are post COVID, where we've seen the NFL defenses really kind of adopt like that Vic Fangio. Like we are going to play a ton of shell coverage. We're getting a lot of 2 high safeties, a lot of cover 4, a lot of cover 6 in the NFL. The middle of the field's open more than ever. Man coverage has gone down 5 years in a row in the NFL. Teams no longer, they don't want to give up 1 or 2 play drives. They want you to make a mistake, have these like 7+ play drives. If you're going to work for a touchdown, if you're going to score a touchdown, you're going to work for it basically. And that's kind of like shifted some of the stuff, especially even for wide receivers. I mean, especially when you look at like elite wide receiver usage, like your wide receiver ones in fantasy football are no longer like when me and Jamie played fantasy football, like your prototypical X wide receiver, right? Like the guy that would just line up at X and be dominant on the football, just command targets. Now we're seeing like all of your wide receiver ones that you have to be versatile. You have to be able to line up inside. You have to have a diverse route tree now in the NFL to combat like what defenses are doing. That's kind of led to some kind of of a change in terms of like coaching trees. And you see it again this year. We continue to see the Shanahan McVay coaching tree get poached and get added to teams. We saw 3 more teams do this again this offseason, and in 4 if you want to count Shade Waldron changing teams. But the Titans moving on from the Tim Kelly offense, to Brian Callahan, and what we've seen, him kind of come from like the McVay coaching tree. We got Clint Kubiak taking over for Pete Carmichael and Dennis Allen. And then we've got Zach Robinson taking over for Arthur Smith, who is like the fantasy punching bag for like basically the last 2 years in Atlanta. And there's a reason these guys keep getting hired. And it's because when you look at like the best offenses in the NFL, like these are the guys that have the consistent answers to beating what current defenses want to do. They're going to run the football on you. All these teams, all these systems have like a run rich background. Even McVay is a team, like when McVay at his best is running the football. And you look at McVay's team splits, like especially in the red zone, like he's heavy on using his running backs in the red zone. And then if you want to play shell coverage, so they're going to run the football on you if you want to play shell coverage. If you want to come up and try to sell out to stop the run, they're going to beat you with, play action and motion and crossover stuff over the middle of the field, which I said, middle of the field open rate has gone up and up the last 4 years. It's increased. Last season was at 44% of all NFL dropbacks. The middle of the field was open pre-snap, which is absolutely kind of bonkers to think about. I'm looking at like a lot of teams now that are one in that coaching tree. And there's 11 teams now that have either one of those 2 guys, like from one of those trees that either calls plays for them. And then if you want to add a 12th team that doesn't come from that tree, Ben Johnson and the Lions, they clearly are attacking defenses in the same capacity. So we're looking for teams that like run play action. We're looking at teams that run a lot of pre-snap motion. You look at last year, wide receivers saw roughly a 15% increase in yards per out run just with pre-snap motion on the play. They had a 31% increase in yards per out run just with play action on the play. So like, I want, couldn't you build a team out of just like a core out of these? I gave you 12 teams. There's 12 teams we can draft from that are in that bucket.
All right, who are the teams?
So we've got obviously the 2 teams that are coached by the 2 guys, Shanahan, McVay. Then you've got the Bengals, you've got the Vikings, the Packers, the Falcons, the Titans, the Saints, the Dolphins, the Texans, the Bears. And then like I said, Ben Johnson doesn't come from that tree, but Ben Johnson's clearly doing all the same stuff those guys are doing.
Yeah, he's a bush right next to the tree. He's in the garden.
I mean, you pretty powerhouse team getting a core out of like those teams, but those guys have the answers right now to what's beating kind of like the current defensive meta. So like, I mean, look at the core of all those players. I don't want a lot of those players anyways.
I love this. All right, Jamie, I want you to react to that. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give myself the 6th pick in the draft. I'm going to draft, like 8 rounds or 10 rounds of just those 12 teams while you talk. Okay. So go on.
Yeah. I think, the evolution of that though, Rich, is for me is the next group of offense coordinators that we're seeing, so like the Stefanski tree, like Petzik going to Arizona, maybe Van Pelt and what he can do to New England, and just to see how that evolves. Obviously now, like what, I don't know if you want to call it this, the Sirianni tree, but like Shane Steichen going to Indianapolis and see how that offense evolves. Because I think you're right. Obviously those 12 teams, you see what they're doing. And clearly, everybody says the Shanahan tree, but it's really both those guys and how those teams have evolved. We've had a fun conversation. I'm curious your take on this. Just where does Kubiak come out? Because 1 year in San Francisco, he obviously has his father's pedigree, right, which is part of this, so, being with Shanahan and obviously knowing how that's going to go. Does he change Derek Carr enough to make Chris Olave into the player I think a lot of people are hoping to see? Does he unlock, let's say Rashid Shaheed or, whoever else is going to step up there, an A.T. Perry or someone who we're, maybe not expecting? Like that one's fascinating to me is the New Orleans situation, yes, because Carr is who he is, in my opinion. And I think it's going to benefit Olave a lot. I think the pre-snap motion is going to benefit him a lot. I think, doing some different things, especially now, Michael Thomas completely out of the way, will change some things a lot. I'm curious your take on the Saints.
Yeah, I mean, well, for Derek Carr, we know from a Derek Carr fantasy perspective, we know who Derek Carr is, which is really easy. Like he's going to be stuck as like a
right. I'm more curious as a thrower.
Yeah, but as a thrower, Derek Carr's been a fine NFL quarterback. And he's also propped up wide receiver ones for fantasy football, like multiple times in his career. So I don't really have like a huge concern of like from that capacity, if you're like talking about like where Chris Olave has been through 2 years. And this offense, like you kind of hit on, like it just had no easy buttons. The Saints last year were dead last in the NFL in rate of play action, dead last in the rate of pre-snap motion. Chris Olave, very small sample size, but he's only behind Tyreek Hill in yards per out run on stuff with pre-snap motion. They just basically asked all of their wide receivers to win on like 2 wide receiver sets, like vertical routes. And it's like hard to live that way in the NFL. You're just going to have a lot of uneven production. You're going to have like a lot of inherent targets that come with a low success rate. That ties over to Rashid Shaheed, who like, a lot of people are like interested in this year. I mean, Shaheed, 30% of his routes were go routes last year. It was the highest rate of any wide receiver to run 4 or more routes. Olave was at 25.5%, which was 9th in the league. As a byproduct of what they asked Olave to do last year in this system, 23% of his targets are 20 or more yards downfield. The only players with as many targets as Olave with a higher rate were Mike Evans and DeAndre Hopkins. So like we're just going to get a lot more easy buttons, and that's just going to give you more consistency. Like you're not going to have to live like that roller coaster ride. The one question that I have, I think, with Olave punching up and breaking kind of like the barrier this year to be like a wide receiver one out of that pocket that like goes in that same group. You have like Olave, Drake London, Garrett Wilson's regarded just like a little bit step higher above those guys, is the touchdowns though, right? Because one thing that's been consistent no matter what system Derek Carr's played in is that he's been an awful red zone quarterback and really awful inside the 10-yard line, particularly like these last 4 years. And when you talk about the Saints in general, like they have already been like knocking on the door for us all off seasons. Like, dude, we're going to continue to use Taysom Hill, like in that area of the field. And there's no reason they shouldn't. When you look at Taysom Hill's like success rate in terms of runs, like inside the 5-yard line and goal line runs, there's no reason. He's well above the NFL base rate in terms of success on those carries, which is a problem for Alvin Kamara too. So the biggest question I have for Olave is not, are we going to see him finally get access to the types of these routes and targets that we kind of look for? It's like, can he get the touchdowns though? And I still think that is like one looming obstacle that like Derek Carr still can like get his like thorn in.
Yeah. Well, it's not Olave exclusively, right? It's Michael Pittman, it's Terry McLaurin. And we talk about this all the time. How do you predict touchdowns? And I wonder how you approach that. Can you even predict touchdowns when you evaluate these players? What do you look at for that stat?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, there is like, when you look at like kind of like the targets that matter for fantasy football, right? Like the types of targets you get. Again, we talked about wanting play action. We talked about wanting pre-snap motion. Obviously, guess what types of targets have the highest correlation to fantasy points per target? End zone targets, right? Like, duh, like, and then then you go deep targets, and you get your red zone targets inside the 10, like stuff like that. So, we're not going to predict like the success rate, but it's just like when gamers look at like a running back and say, well, he had X amount of opportunities inside the 5, and he just didn't convert these below the base rate. Like there's a pretty easy regression call. We can kind of look at those things from a career stance and say like, well, who are these guys that consistently get these targets in the end zone, and kind of pick away from there and kind of find a way. And Olave's a guy who actually hasn't to this point gotten a high rate of targets in the end zone. And then when you double that with Derek Carr stuff, yes, like I said, Olave is a big standout in terms of getting like more easier buttons. I think he's gonna have a higher floor than he's had in recent years, but like the touchdowns are going to matter for him kind of crashing that ceiling. Whereas you might be able to look at a guy like Drake London and say, oh, like he is a guy that's gotten a ton of end zone or Garrett Wilson, is if you're splitting hairs between these 3 guys that are kind of near each other. And those 2 guys have literally just been fed terrible, inaccurate targets in the end zone. I mean, 38% of Garrett Wilson's end zone targets have been inaccurate quarterback throws. Like that's absolutely like an insane rate. And then, Drake London isn't far behind in that span. These guys are getting accurate quarterback upgrades in terms of Kirk Cousins and Aaron Rodgers, who are ironically coming off of Achilles tears on different feet though, which I had Stephania Bell on my show, and she actually said like it might mean more for Kirk Cousins' deep ball, like the fact that it's his plant leg, than Aaron Rodgers. But I'm no doctor, so don't take that from me.
So let's talk about this group of receivers, I guess. And There's a top 8 at receiver: Lamb, Hill, Jefferson, Chase, St. Brown, A.J. Brown, Garrett Wilson, Puka Nacua. And then really there's a top 9. There's Marvin Harrison. It gets pretty interesting after that. So you, Jamie, who's right after Harrison for you at wide receiver 10?
Today, because it changes almost on a daily basis, because, like Rich said, it feels like, you can make an argument for each of these guys in different ways. Right now, it's Olave, London, Waddle for me.
How about you, Rich? First of all, do you have Harrison at 9, and what's after that?
No, I mean, I get have you guys been drafting Harrison where he goes? It's really tough. I get why he's ranked there. So a lot of people see Harrison as a 1-2 turn player now, and they're like, ooh, that is rich. And it is rich, but in context of the position, because wide receivers are just being drafted higher than they were a decade ago. It used to be like the 1-2 turn was like the wide receiver 5. Now it's the wide receiver, like we said, 10. It does, like, I get why he's ranked there, but when you look at just rookie wide receivers taken in the top 10 in the NFL in the 2000s, only one was a PPR wide receiver 1 in points per game. It was Jamar Chase. We're talking about guys like AJ Green, Julio Jones, Calvin Johnson, Larry Fitzgerald, guys that are Hall of Famers still weren't even that. So like, it is rich to kind of take him there. I get why he's there. I haven't been able to click the button there, especially when the delta from Marvin Harrison to Malik Neighbors is so far. Where you just get more insulation. Like, even if Neighbors fails, I feel like if he fails as my wide receiver 3 in the 3rd round, or my wide receiver 2, that's different than like taking a guy on the turn versus players that I know are probably, a little bit more safer, or think that like I have a little more confidence in. I mean, did you conclude Garrett Wilson there? Garrett Wilson for me is the next guy, like, pretty easily.
I had him, in the top 8.
Okay. So you had Garrett Wilson there.
Yeah.
I think I favor London versus Olave just a smidge more, but that's just because like I factor in the touchdown stuff. I think London has a better access to maybe quality touchdown stuff. And then the Falcons have an easier schedule. And like I said, they project for more points than the Saints. So I would use those things to kind of split those ties, but I have no problem with anyone that has Olave there.
Yeah. I mean, some people
there. You guys don't have you're not taking him there, but a guy I think that belongs in this bucket that doesn't get included in this conversation at all. And I know Heath's not on here. Like, George Pickens is what's the difference between George Pickens and these guys? Like, really,
I love Pickens. Love Pickens.
But he should be included in from an archetypical stance. And I have them. And when I tier my guys from an archetypical stance, like, Pickens is in this tier for me. And you get him. This is what we call arbitrage, right? You're getting something at a lower value, like that's not valued at the same cost. Pickens belongs in this tier. Absolutely. He's year 3 wide receiver. He's been better than Drake London, through 2 years in the NFL. And then when you look at his splits with and without Deontay Johnson last year, I mean, he had a 28% team target share and almost 3 yards per out run with Deontay Johnson off the field last year. The 4 games that Deontay Johnson didn't play last year, he goes 4 for 127 and a touchdown, 4 for 75. He has a dud, the 3 for 25, and then he has 6 for 130 and a touchdown. By the way, those 2 big games came against the Cleveland Browns and Baltimore Ravens, who had 2 of the better defenses in the NFL last year. He's a big play machine. And granted, we could talk about, he's getting Arthur Smith, who Drake London just had, but Pickens was already wide receiver 44 in routes per game last season, and still turned in enough splash plays to go over 1,000 yards and be viable. I think Pickens, from an archetypical stance, belongs in this conversation.
It's interesting. You're the first person, I think, to say it that aggressively, which I like. I think Pickens does have the opportunity to jump to this point. And this will be, I think, one of those guys that, certainly by ADP, he's going to, I don't want to say shatter his ADP, but he definitely has the opportunity to, make a lot of people regret not taking him higher. My concern is not Arthur Smith, because Arthur Smith was good as a coordinator for A.J. Brown, for example, when they were in Tennessee, and he had a veteran quarterback. I spoke to him last year in regards to Kyle Pitts, and it's kind of one of those things, like, when you talk to enough NFL coaches and you kind of, you can read through coach speak. He was basically saying, he's like, when we had Matt Ryan, Kyle Pitts was going to get fed targets. Without Matt Ryan, I'm a little concerned. So like, you could tell he was a little concerned about his quarterback situation. So I think with a veteran, quarterback in Russ, he's sort of fast. He's the first guy I was thinking about when you're talking about the middle of the field, because he's afraid to throw in the middle of the field.
Yeah.
And so how much of that will kind of limit Pickens is one
it's
of my
basically
concerns.
Killed his career, and it might have killed Deshaun Watson's, but
yeah,
amongst things. But like, as you think of Deshaun Watson, a very similar Russell Wilson-esque type player, wants to extend plays, wants to push the ball downfield. And that's basically been the demise of Russell Wilson.
Right. But in terms of Pickens, like, I think those things will help Pickens, similar to what Cortland Sutton did, and, similar things that DK Metcalf and even Tyler Lockett have done, if you look at his track record. But does only staying in a certain area of the field limit Pickens' breakout potential? Like, that's a little bit of my concern.
Yeah. And I'd agree that I think it's a valid concern to have with him. Yeah. I mean, what do you guys, so like we talked a little bit about London. The wild card factor here that I think that's the hardest thing to figure out with the Atlanta Falcons is, so like this system has never had a player like Kyle Pitts. And part of my theory of Kyle Pitts outside of the injury stuff is Kyle Pitts' greatest gift has also been his greatest curse in the NFL, is that teams want to use him in a unique way because of the skill set he provides. But that unique way that he can be used versus other tight ends is kind of what leads to him getting like really shitty fantasy production. Like that, like it, but so like, how does this, because this offense has always relied on, the system has always used their tight ends as like an inline player, and they haven't had guys, like I said, like Kyle Pitts. Like the better tight ends that have been in this system, like basically we say like from this coaching tree, have been guys like, a George Kittle, a TJ Hawkinson, guys that can play in line. So Kyle Pitts is one of those things, like guys, that's just really hard to figure out, like what's his role in this offense. We know this offense is going to create easy button throws. Who gets them? Is it going to be Pitts or is it going to be London? I think when you go back to London's profile coming out of USC, it would lead me to believe it's going to be more London than Pitts, because London was a player that had a lot of manufactured production his senior year, not his senior year, because he didn't play. It was his final year at USC. He was a guy that had just a ton of screens and manufactured production. 44% of his yards did come after the catch at his final year at USC. And when you're talking about like guys that can get like the route tree, like Puka Nacua ran, like it's easier to say from the surface, like, well, that could be Drake London. Whereas Kyle Pitts, you kind of have to say like, what is Zach Robinson going to do with a player like Kyle Pitts? And that's like the thing we don't know.
Yeah.
I'm hopeful that'll kind of be a red zone option for Cousins, because that's kind of what he's done. You look at Kyle Rudolph and then Hawkinson and sort of that role that the tight end played for him. So how much input will he have on that? But yeah, for Robinson, I think, how he uses Pitts, I just make him a big slot. Like, just use him in that opportunity, because you're still going to get mismatches. The idea, Arthur Smith putting him on the outside and trying to make him a wide receiver essentially was just waste, in my opinion. You're taking away the opportunity to get mismatches on linebackers and safeties. And I think that's where he would absolutely eat if in fact they use him that way.
Yeah, I think among tight ends with, I think it's 40, maybe 50 targets, Kyle Pitts, in all three of his seasons, he's ranked first in ADOT, highest ADOT, and first or second in percentage of snaps lined up out wide. So you just like, you gotta, if you're a tight end with a 10.9, 13.8, 11.4 yard ADOT, you better have good quarterback play, which he hasn't. But again, we want some more catches, some shorter routes, get him in the slot. That'd be wonderful. Jamie talking a lot of trash about me on a text message, which is not cool. So I'll tell you all about that when we come back from this commercial break on Fantasy Football Today. Wow. So message me, Jamie, and Dan Schneier. Jamie says, Adam off to a great start with Rich Hribar. Adam, what are the things you look at with advanced metrics? Rich, good players, good offense, usage, etc. Adam, yeah, okay. Is that really how it happened? And then Dan said, Rich is one of my favorite analysts. So that's, you get that shout. But I really like that it come off that bad. All right, I'm sorry if it did. So, I love talking about this group of wide receivers. So let's talk about your projections for the Texans and the 49ers, because in this group of receivers, we have Nico Collins and two 49ers guys, Debo and Ayuk. The efficiency for the 49ers last year was absolutely off the charts. I'm sure you can't expect the same yards per attempt for Purdy. All the metrics for Ayuk were ridiculous. Even Kittle was extremely efficient. Debo's crazy. He's always like crazy efficient. But I don't know. So you got those 49ers guys, and then you got the Stephon Diggs factor now with the Texans. Where do you want to start, Texans or Niners?
We'll do the 49ers because I mean it's like still pretty cut and dry because we've seen this like there's projection with the Texans that we don't know, or the 49ers we've already seen it, right? Like we've seen all these guys play in unison. This is what makes it hard to like find anything for Ricky Pearsall, right? Like is like until one of these guys is gone, and what remains to be determined. Like if these last 2 months we do see one of these guys get traded, but
stop there for a second. Who do you think benefits?
Who do I think benefits from the trade?
Yeah.
Like in what capacity?
If Ayuk is gone, does Pearsall just fill that role, or does Debo go back to being like 2021 Debo?
Yeah, it's really weird because Pearsall's kind of a mix of both guys. Like when you look at where Pearsall won in college, it's kind of like they hedged their bets for both guys because he has like that rushing return profile that like Debo had, and like the missed tackle stuff that like Debo has, but then he wins on like in-breaking stuff in terms of like he's a better route runner. That's been Ayuk's calling card, like basically in the NFL. I'll say this: if one of the guys for the 49ers were to get traded, I have more confidence that Brandon Ayuk would have like a large upswing. Like if you give Brandon Ayuk 150 targets, I think even with poor quarterback play, like we want that for fantasy football. Whereas like Debo, we still got to count on the next offense he's in for like a team to use him right and use him correctly. He's just been the marriage for Debo and Kyle Shanahan is like, I don't think he can get better.
No, right now, I think what Jamie's saying, let's say Ayuk gets traded.
Yeah. Who's it better for?
How do you
it's gotta be Pearsall. Like Pearsall is like a complete, just like the value would just be so much to get.
Tremendous.
Right?
Yes.
But Debo, I think I would think about.
I would say Kittle, to be honest. I would say Kittle would be the dude, because you look at Kittle's production when just one of these guys has been off the field last year. So over the past 2 seasons, Kittle has run 557 pass routes with both Debo and Ayuk on the field at the same time. He's been targeted on just 17.2% of those routes and has just 15.7% of the team targets, only 1.64 yards per route run. He's run 336 routes with either one of those guys off the field. He's been targeted on 23.8%, again, versus 17. It's like 7% increase. 21.9% of the team targets, up from 15.7%. 2.59 yards per route run, up for 1.64. Like, I think it would be easily Kittle. Kittle's been one of these guys. He regularly goes like tight end 6. He goes after, we talk about Kyle Pitts like pretty regularly. He goes after Dalton Kincaid pretty regularly. He goes sometimes after Evan Ingram, which is an odd one. Because you look at Evan Ingram, like he's been another guy that's been reliant on like who's been on the field for the Jaguars and has way less touchdown upside and way less explosive play upside than Kittle. But I would say Kittle, if either guy gets traded, Kittle would be the guy that gets spiked.
Talking about them not being traded, I don't ever draft George Kittle if none of them are traded because of those stats you just mentioned. And they played 11 games last year where Ayuk, Debo, McCaffrey, and Kittle all played their normal snap share. That's including the postseason. And in those 11 games, George Kittle was on pace. Actually pretty good numbers because he was so efficient, 900 yards and 8 touchdowns, but only 88 targets. And, like that really scares me with Kittle. And Debo was on pace for 109 targets plus 43 carries. Ayuk was on pace for 116 targets, which is still pretty low for a guy that some people are taking in the second round. So It's very tough for me because of, you said earlier, get guys on good offenses. And by the way, I did make my all-star team of picking 6th of having players from just those 12 teams. We can come back to that later if you want. But
hope the other people in this draft for you were just, allowing you to take the.
No, it was all based on ADP. I mean, it's a very reasonable team to have.
How nice the other 11 people.
Yeah, I'm just saying that I could have gotten all these guys. But anyway, anywho. I want the 49ers, but I find them, other than McCaffrey, I find them to be, Debo, Ayuk, Kittle, I find them to be a little too expensive for me, Rich. I don't know how you feel about that.
I think that's fair, but I think it depends on how you started your draft, right? Because that tier of wide receivers that I think these guys are included in, they all have like an element of contingency value to them. I would say like Puka Nacua, Nico Collins, Debo, Ayuk, DJ Moore, Devontae Smith, T. Higgins, Jalen Waddle, and if you want to include Tank Dell, like those guys are all good players that have higher splits when another guy's off the field. And we know, like I said, there's that contingency factor. But if you started with an elite wide receiver, you're your floor for having one of these guys as your wide receiver 2 versus your wide receiver 1 is different, right? If Brandon Ayuk's your wide receiver 1, you feel differently than if you have him with Tyreek Hill, right? And that's kind of like, how you have to play your draft and like how you try to factor in, like, if you're more risk averse to like this archetype of player that needs a kind of a door open to him. I think from just like a top down stance, the fact that Debo is the one when all three are on the field together, Debo gets used the most, and the fact that he gets used most because it's easier to use him the most. He has a lower ADOT. He gets rushing production, and it's created a little bit more consistency from an inconsistent type player, if that makes any type of sense. If I can use it together. I think if you're like, I still have Debo ahead of Ayuk because of that. Like, just treating it as if the 49ers are going into the season with all these guys, I edge Debo over Ayuk because of his usage. I think it's been consistent. The 49ers have been able to get him the football regularly when these three guys are on the field.
I find I just did this in the fishbowl. I think Debo's got another, sort of carrot dangling as well. Yeah. McCaffrey at 28 and coming off a year with over 400 touches. If he were to miss time, I think Debo's rushing production goes up significantly because that's what we saw.
Receiving, I'd say.
Both. But, I think just the additional part of that is they'll obviously use Mitchell and Garendo and whoever else they're going to, throw back there if McCaffrey's gone. But, Debo will get his touches in a little bit different way. And based on Shannon, like, you said it great, Rich, that you said it perfectly, Rich, that, the marriage between these two guys, like, it would kind of be fascinating to see if he went to another part of the tree, the Shanahan tree, and who would use Debo in the same kind of regard, because you think that they would. You've heard of different receivers, the next Debo. Like, it was sort of attached to Jaden Reed, for example.
Malachi Curley.
With Malachi Curley, right? Yes, McCoy. So, but I think, for anybody doing best ball drafts, the 49ers are fascinating, absolutely fascinating, because if there is a trade or an injury, which we've seen quite a bit, Pearsall could be an absolute monster. He's such a steal. Debo, I think, benefits in a huge way. Kittle, like you said, benefits in a huge way. And with the right situation, like, and I'm curious your take on this one, because you mentioned it. If Ayuk goes to Washington, is that the ideal situation for him? Because he will get targets, but he's in a crowded receiving core, at least on paper, and a rookie quarterback who's going to run.
Yeah, I definitely don't think Washington's an upgrade. So I'm always hesitant on players that play with rookie quarterbacks anyways. If you look at historical production, wide receivers have a dip in production year one with a rookie quarterback. Now, sometimes you run into CJ Stroud and he unlocks everything. Just the way it is. But, we've seen guys like Calvin Johnson, Mike Evans, like, again, Hall of Famers, like, have a dip in production with year one wide receivers. One other quick stat on the 49ers thing. So over the past years, there hasn't been a week in which both Debo Samuel and Brandon Ayuk were wide receiver 1 scorers the same week. There's been just 6 weeks where they've been top 24 scorers the same week. That's kind of the rub. The difference I think you have between the 49ers and the Texans, though, is you can take Purdy. You don't have to play the pancake game. You can take the syrup game. Like, Purdy is just being discounted. Houston, you still have to pay the iron price for CJ Stroud. And that's what makes the whole situation harder to gauge. Like, you can just take Purdy, though. Like, to me, the standout here is I look at the QB landscape and I'm like, why is Brock Purdy behind Tua? Like I don't understand it. Like, it's like, so like, you could just take Purdy and play the 49er situation that way.
All right, let's go talk about the Texans then. And let me ask you, with the 3 wide receivers, which ADP do you, if you were going to take one of them, let's say Nico Collins is around 2 to 3 pick, Stephon Diggs is 4 to 5, and Dell is probably 5, maybe into 6. What do you think the best value is for the 3 receivers?
I mean, so far in these drafts that we've been doing, granted it's best ball stuff, I've been largely just taking the cheapest guy. I mean, I definitely, if you're putting my feet to the fire, I'm obviously going to favor Nico Collins, like the public, from an archetypical stance. Like, they paid him. He's a guy that is like, if you're making a wide receiver to be your lead wide receiver, looks the part, is the part, had the breakout with Stroud. The thing that gets tough, so Nico Collins and Tank Dell were on the field last year for only 34% of CJ Stroud's dropback. Like, we didn't really even get like a huge sample of them even playing together. And both of these guys benefited when the other guy was off the field in the same capacity. We talk about this 49er situation, 210 passing plays, both guys on the field last year. Nico Collins was targeted on 29.5% of his routes with Tank Dell off the field, as opposed to 22.9% with Dell on the field. That's the difference between wide receiver 3 in target rate versus wide receiver 30. It's a chasm. Tank Dell was targeted on 29.1% of his routes with Collins off the field, compared to a 20.6 rate with Collins on the field. Again, it's like the same exact split. And that doesn't factor in, that you're throwing another guy into the equation here with Stephon Diggs. When those two players, Collins and Dell, were on the field last year, they had 50% of the team targets. The next closest player on the team was at 15.8%, Dalton Schultz. I'm pretty confident that if Stephon Diggs, while healthy, is going to have a higher target share than 15.8%. Whether your opinion on Stephon Diggs is that he's washed, a declining player, or not, I'm pretty sure that the target share is going to be higher. If it's not, Stephon Diggs is going to let you know about it. I think that we know that as well. Also, it's hard to say Stephon Diggs is like supremely washed, because I'm pretty sure guys that are just dead don't go over 100 yards in 5 of their first 6 games of the season last year. Like, there's a lot that went into like the real catawampa splits that that Stephon Diggs had last year, whether it be coaching change, the schedule. Like the Bills faced an absolute like rogues gallery of good pass defenses to close the end last year. Josh Allen also was not nearly as good the back half of the year that he was the front half. I mean, it's 15th in completion rate, 18th in yards per pass attempt, 13th in accuracy, rating over those, final 11 games of the year. So like, there's a lot that goes into it. It's hard to kind of figure out. Like, Grant, he's now, like we talked about the open though, he's 31 this November. He's just hard to kind of bet on, like, where like he is moving into like the sauce here with these other guys. Anytime that I hear CJ Stroud talk, he talks about Tank Dell. It's like something always on my radar. Like, he always brings up Tank Dell. It's hard to ignore, but like when you look at Tank Dell, he's a guy that's like screaming regression from like what he did. I mean, he had 7 touchdowns as a rookie. His expected total was 3.8. He converted the highest rate of end zone targets of any wide receiver with 5 or more end zone targets. He scored 4 of his touchdowns from outside the red zone. Very hard to just lean on those things and say they're static. So like the Texans are a team that, like, man, I just honestly haven't been getting a lot of them because the ADPs are all pretty rich. I can't honestly tell you. I don't know how the target's all projection. We haven't seen any of these guys play because we didn't even see Collins and Dell play together. And then the quarterback is expensive as well. We can't even say, all right, let's just take CJ Stroud because he consistently goes as QB5, QB6, and he doesn't run. And it's like hard to take that quarterback that doesn't run with that kind of, draft capital in fantasy football. Like historically, that's been where guys bust the most. This archetype of quarterback at this draft cost. I think the Texans are just a complete enigma, man. Like it's tough. It's tough because we expect them to be good.
Well, that actually kind of brings me. I was going to talk to you about the Ravens and the Ravens having 4 players in the top 50 in average draft position: Derrick Henry, Lamar Jackson, Zay Flowers, and Mark Andrews. But, I'm trying to find, I went back to the last 3 seasons and looked for teams that gave us that kind of production. Basically, three flex options that finished in the top 70 overall, which is about the top 50 if you remove quarterbacks, usually about 20 quarterbacks in the top 70. I did find one team, I think only one, that had 4 players, which is 4 flexes, which is what we'd be looking at with the Texans, right? Those 3 receivers plus Mixon.
Yeah, plus Mixon.
I think that's only happened one time in the last 3 years, and it was the Dallas Cowboys in 2021. They had Zeke, Lamb, Cooper, and Dalton Schultz. And it's much easier, obviously. This is overall, so never mind. I was going to say for a tight end. So it's probably pretty hard for the Texans to live up to their ADPs, just with 5 players going in the top 70. But one thing I did notice, this is why it really shocked me that the Ravens have 4 players in the top 50. There's 5 or 6 a year, 5 or 6 teams that give us 3 flexes, and then probably a quarterback. Yeah. In the top 70 overall, including quarterbacks. Only one of those teams over the last 3 years out of 16 teams has had a truly mobile quarterback, like a big rusher. And it was the Eagles in 2022. And it's just like, do mobile quarterbacks, like I think, I don't remember when I said this with Heath or something like that, but do mobile quarterbacks like kind of suck for everyone else?
As someone who wrote the original Konami Code article, in 2013, which is feels forever ago now. One of the things I highlighted when I do these like yearly league-wide trends, I do a league-wide trend article for each position. And one of the things I highlighted starting 2 years ago was that the rushing quarterbacks and the influx of rushing quarterbacks, we're getting more athletes playing quarterback, obviously, because human evolution, than we ever have. And this year we got more athletic quarterbacks, and we're seeing them really damage the running back production. And what we talk about with running backs kind of in this current like defensive meta, they have to combat two things now. One, we don't have like the bell cows anymore. The guys that play 3 downs, almost every backfield's compartmentalized. You have a specialist for a role in a backfield now. It's what made like these elite running backs more of a finite resource. And this year we've got Christian McCaffrey, and you have like a 2-man mini tier after him where you're like, this guy could be the next Christian McCaffrey, and Bijan Robinson and Breece Hall. And then you immediately get to Jahmyr Gibbs, who you hope could be that, but has to share a backfield with someone. So we only have really 3 clear guys in that role. But mobile quarterbacks have also started to reduce receptions, target share. So running back target share, league-wide target share has gone down 6 years in a row. And it's because we continue to get more mobile quarterbacks. Touches inside the 5-yard line, quarterbacks continue to take increased role of that. Again, last year, 21.8% of all rushing attempts inside the 5 were by quarterbacks last year. You go back to just 2010, it was only 11.1%. So like we're getting like it's significant. You don't want a guy that plays the mobile quarterbacks. It makes that secondary tier of running back so hard, right? The post Gibbs tier where you have Jonathan Taylor, Saquon, and Derrick Henry, like these guys that are like, yeah, these guys have been RB1s in the past, but they don't project to have a lot of receptions. They project to play with a mobile quarterback. So will they get a lot of touchdowns? The one thing Derrick Henry has going for him is the Ravens have continuously not really used Lamar Jackson in the same capacity that the Eagles have used the tush push. And we think that Shane Steichen wants to use Anthony Richardson. We just didn't really see a sample of Anthony Richardson and Jonathan Taylor last year. They only played 2 snaps together the entire season. But, Richardson did have 40% of the designed runs, inside the 10 for the Colts while he was on the field. But the Ravens don't. Like the Ravens don't do that. Ravens running backs had 40 rushing attempts in goal-to-goal situations last year. Their running backs had 20 rushing touchdowns. Gus Edwards had 13. It's really easy to say Derrick Henry's still going to score a lot of touchdowns. The problem with Derrick Henry always has been when he doesn't score a touchdown, what are you getting? And that's when you have to take these guys in this capacity, right? That's where Saquon falls now, transitioning to the Eagles. It's where Jonathan Taylor has been basically for his career too. Derrick Henry, 19.5 PPR points per game for his career when he scores a touchdown. 5.5 points per game without a touchdown. Like that's the floor you get. And that's what sucks versus the wide receivers that we talk about. Like your wide receivers are going to have inherent higher floors, especially in your full PPR leagues than those running backs, because when those running backs give you duds, they're not catching passes and they're not scoring touchdowns. That's what makes it so tough for that secondary tier. But the Ravens are a team. I think the passing game is like the toughest part, right? Like Zay Flowers, I think, has been one of the more overdrafted players, and he's a guy you look for. He plays a good quarterback, and he does have that kind of going for him on the youth spectrum. But the dude scored 2 touchdowns with Mark Andrews on the field last year, right? Like his splits with Mark Andrews on off the field are wild. And Mark Andrews himself has missed multiple games the past 4 years. 3 of the past 4 years since multiple games, so it makes it tough to kind of pay up for him. The usage is there for him, but yeah, the Ravens are a real tricky team to diagnose. I did see the Derrick Henry workout videos, though, and he still scares me.
Hope you didn't hear anything that we just said about him, right?
Yeah.
So who would you take first, Mark Andrews or Zay Flowers?
I still would take Zay Flowers, I think, more. I think Andrews, the way I'm drafting tight ends, I do want him to fall a little bit. Because like I said, I think I can fall back and take a shot on Pitts later, right? And maybe have more upside, or if one of these 49ers goes off the boards. So like, I feel like I can manufacture what Mark Andrews does at tight end a little bit more than I do potentially what like we could get from the top guys, the top guys, like a Kelce at his best, right? Like Kelce at his best has never been combatable. It's been like Gronk levels. So like, that's why you still have to respect Kelce.
Okay, so I mentioned that over the last 3 seasons, we've had 16 teams that have had 3 flex options finish in the top 70 overall, which is about top 50 if you remove the quarterbacks. There is one team, it's not 16 different teams, 16 instances. One team that has done it all 3 years, that has had a combination of running back, wide receiver, tight end, all finish basically in the top 50 of flex options, top 70 of offensive players. Can anyone name that team?
One of each?
I think every year it's been 2 wide receivers and 1 running back.
In the last 3 years?
They won a Super Bowl in this stretch.
The Chiefs.
No, the Chiefs, no, they've only shown up on this list 1 time, although they're always flirting.
No, because of Kelce. Kelce ruins it.
Yeah.
Well, they haven't really had the running back until last year.
Right.
Yeah.
Receivers and a running back.
And it's always been a different, I want to say it's been a different running back, maybe every year, and 2 different quarterbacks in this stretch. It's been the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. All 3 years, they've given us 3 really good flex options. And the quarterbacks for these teams have been Justin Herbert, Tom Brady twice, Kirk Cousins twice, Joe Burrow twice, Dak, Jalen Hurts, Geno Smith, Trevor Lawrence twice. The Jaguars have actually done it 2 years in a row. 2 years ago, Zay Jones finished as a top 70 player. Jared Goff twice, Patrick Mahomes, Brock Purdy, and Baker Mayfield.
Yeah, again, you want your skill players not to be tied to mobile quarterbacks,
right? It's a pretty interesting takeaway. It's cool stuff. All right, before you go, give me like one breakout for 2024.
I mean, I think it's I'd say Rashid Shaheed, like everyone else. It's just like I said, he's like the guy when you're talking about like from an ADP stance, especially where he goes. He's just kind of an easy click to play all those things. I mean, he has been a really good player when he's been used so far through 2 seasons, and then we saw his target share spike, go from 14% target rate per out run when he plays snaps with Michael Thomas up to 21% last year, and then the coaching changes that we kind of highlighted. He would be the guy I would kind of look for in that area that I just frequently click.
Jamie, that's interesting. We don't talk a lot about Shaheed. Maybe we should.
Well, I mean, we certainly did earlier this week with their Scott Fishbowl discussion because he's everybody's favorite player in Fishbowl. But yeah, no, it's a great call. Again, if you're buying into Derek Carr and the new offense there, he's got as much of an opportunity as anybody, just with the opening for targets and playing time.
Okay. Would you like to see the team I drafted from the 6th spot?
Yeah. Give it to us.
All right. So these are just the 11 teams that come from the McVay-Shanahan coaching tree that have that coaching philosophy, plus the Detroit Lions. So we have Jamar Chase in round 1, Kyron Williams in round 2, Jalen Waddle in round 3, Alvin Kamara round 4, T. Higgins round 5. So our 5, receivers and running backs are Kyron and Kamara, Chase, Waddle, Higgins, Kyle Pitts in round 6, Aaron Jones is going to be our RB3.
This team's amazing.
Christian Watson in round 8. And then quarterback, I didn't take a quarterback high, so I'm going to go with some combination of Caleb Williams, Brock Purdy, and Tua Tagovailoa.
It's an amazing team.
And honestly, like pretty realistic. I think wouldn't be able to hit all of those, but I think you could pretty much pull that off. Oh, yeah, it's a good. Yeah. All right, let's do it. I love this. It's great. Rich, how can we find you? Where are you?
I'm at sharpfootballanalysis.com. We just had the 2024 preview book, kind of release. That just came out that we worked on. I'm putting out like my massive tiers this week. Wide receivers will be out today to kind of wrap that up, but the quarterbacks are free. If you're not part of the draft kit, the quarterbacks are free. If you just kind of want to get an idea of what level of detail we're talking about that I put into these, because I'm someone that does their tiers a little differently. I don't just break off my rankings. I do it by archetype. Like we talked about the George Pickens thing, right? Like, so I do it so you can spot potential arbitrage throughout your draft. So definitely, go check those out over at sharpfootballanalysis.com.
Yeah. I think, would you say massive tiers?
That's massive tiers.
Well, that's what happens when Jamie plays me in fantasy. And on that note,
especially when you draft by yourself. I mean, those teams are amazing.
I'm sorry that this is a very realistic team, and it is.
You'll assign me players from all the non-Shanahan McVay teams, right?
Yeah, you could do that.
Yeah, you don't want to, and obviously you're not going to be as rigid to only take players of those teams, but it's kind of fun to say, like, I could build my because you're going to want Chiefs and you're going to want, Eagles dudes, but like, it is what it's fun.
Well, all I know is if I learn anything from this conversation. It's that Varsity Blues probably has a pretty good soundtrack. And we will talk to you tomorrow with a mailbag, fantasyfootball@cbsi.com. Also throw some Apple Podcast questions in there. For Rich Hribar, Jamie Eisenberg, I'm Adam Azer. We'll talk to you tomorrow.